Okay. I'm just checking that I'm recording for Barry primarily. So we are recording this session, so I can proceed. So first of all, what I want to do is just run over the process, the whole course process, to make sure everyone's clear about that. As you know, we kind of divide the course into two stages: the theoretical and then the practical. The theory, most of you have either completed that or a long way through it. Once you've completed the theory exam, you then get into stage two, and that's split into two parts. The creating the operations manual, we get you to fill out a really simple form. Once you've completed that, generates an ops manual draft for you. You then tweak that to put your specific details in. It's really not a big job. Once you're happy with it, you just email it to Marnie, our training administrator. She'll kind of put it in my workflow to review. Now, I do usually tweak your ops manual, and I'm afraid I'm a bit fussy about things like page breaks and layout and that type of thing. So almost always I can't resist the temptation to actually make a few changes to it, but they're usually pretty trivial. When I'm happy with it, I approve it, and you're then sent an email with a link to our booking system so that you can book your flight assessment. And if you want to do any flight training, which we'll talk about later, you can book that using the same system. So you do your flight assessment. That takes half a day. And when you're done with that, you're effectively finished with the course. And the next job is to get your application into the CAA, the application for your permission for commercial operations. And really our involvement in that is pretty straightforward. I will re-review your operations manual as the kind of one last step, because occasionally, especially this time of year when the weather's naff, in between me approving your ops manual, oh, hang on, I just realized I don't think I'm sharing this screen with you, am I? Bear with me just a second. It's not a disaster, but we ought to have that up and running. Where's it gone? Here we go. Okay, can you see the that PowerPoint slide now? Okay, yeah, sorry about that. Yeah, in between you having your ops manual approved and then moving forward to book your flight assessment, sometimes there's a bit of a gap. If you end up having to reschedule because of the weather, or there's other issues come up in your life, it's occasionally when we can have gaps of a month or two quite easily. And it's not inconceivable that the CAA kind of subtly move the goalposts during that period of time. And in fact, they have just moved the goalposts a little bit. I think for the most part, we've got it squared off, but they've made it clear, for example, that where we use the date, any date in the operations manual, rather than do something like 19th of the 2nd /20, it's got to be /2020. Because somebody there realized that if it's just 20, it would be really easy to add a couple of digits onto the end of it, which is kind of a unique situation, but it kind of makes sense, I suppose. So they're checking for that, and they're also with the flight logs, they're being a little bit more pernickety than they used to be. So they're insisting now on there being a single entry for each flight, as defined by a single use of a battery. So if they see a flight log, for example, with a Mavic 2 that lasts 45 minutes, let's say, which people do, they just add up all the flight time for a day, they'll reject that. So they're looking for an individual entry for each flight, as defined by the use of a single battery. So just as examples, it's worth just doing that final check. If necessary, I'll update it and make a few tweaks to it. When I'm happy with it, I'll issue this magic document, the certificate of recommendation, which is the most important document really you get out of this process. And you then, we send it to you by email with instructions as to how to apply for your permission. Okay. That's all done online. I'll talk about that in a bit more detail in a second. Submitted to the CAA is then just a question of waiting till they turn it around, and eventually they will issue your permission, and it arrives really spectacularly by email. You don't get anything in the post. There's no nicely printed certificate. It's just a PDF document that you get. But as soon as you get that in your hands, you can get on with it. You can start operating. You can just move on and get on with the real job that you're intending to do. So any questions at all on the process in kind of high level terms? No? Okay. So the actual application process itself is online. It's pretty straightforward. Right at the end of the process, you pay the application fee, and as part of the process, you upload the files for your operations manual and the NQE recommendation. And in that email that I send to you, once I've checked your ops manual, I send you the files that you should upload, because it's really easy in this process to get a bit mixed up with versions and so on, and mistakenly upload the wrong version. So I send you the versions that, as far as I'm concerned, are ready to go, so that you can just save them to your desktop and then upload them from there. When you get your permission, it's valid for a year, and the renewal process, which you can start up to 90 days before the expiry of your permission, is done in exactly the same way through the same online system. And the only difference really is that when you apply for a renewal, you don't need to upload your NQE recommendation again, but you do need to upload a pilot log with the preceding 3 months of flights in it, and the total time for those flights needs to be more than 120 minutes. So that's where the pilot logs come in. You don't need to submit pilot logs on the initial application. Okay.
Can I just ask, sorry, see the pilot logs, do they have to be over the last 3 months? Or
well, you don't have to worry about it for your initial application. They're not expecting you to submit logs for that. This is really when you come up for your first renewal after a year. So, most people, 90 days is a bit overkill, to be frank. They're turning them around reasonably quickly, typically about a fortnight. But I certainly would be thinking about it maybe, 8 weeks or so before your permission expires. It is straightforward. It's a question of making sure your ops manual is up to date. If there's been any changes in regulations, that type of thing, documents, some of the documents you reference, there may have been updates to those. So those document references need to be updated with the latest versions and that type of thing. So you make sure your ops manual is up to date, and then you submit that with your pilot log, and the pilot log just needs to cover the 3 months preceding the date that you submit your application.
So sorry, can I ask, sorry, for the initial, the initial application, does it matter about pilot logs? Is what I'm wondering.
No, you don't need to worry about it.
I've been a bit naughty at not quite keeping logs that maybe I should have.
Well, no, don't worry about that at this stage. It's nice, and we do recommend that when people start doing the course, they start keeping logs. If you're flying a DJI system, it's kind of tracking it for you anyway. So, frankly, you don't really need to worry too much about it, because all the information is there. But it's a good practice to get into. And apart from anything else, individuals need to work out how they're going to manage their logbooks. I've never really done a kind of survey or anything, but my sense is most people just end up using a spreadsheet, because in many ways it's the most straightforward way of doing it. But quite a few use one of the applications the kind of logbook stroke drone management applications that are around, and there's a reasonable number of them. The one I see probably most of all is drone logbook, and that sucks data from your DJI log to update itself and gives you lots of analysis. And actually, it has a report format that the CA will accept. So, there's some advantages in using those, but a lot of people just find it easier just to do it on a spreadsheet. Keeps it nice and simple, and then just print that off. And again, if we do offer a renewal support service, there's no requirement for you to use it. It's just that quite a lot of people would prefer to have someone help them out with it, particularly the ops manual updates. And if you take advantage of that, we check your pilot logs as well to make sure that the format's okay, that you've got enough hours and so on. I mean, it's not a big deal, but it's amazing how many pilot logs we get as part of that service that the CA would bounce. And it can be silly things like even if you've got your name on top of the page, they want to see the pilot name as a column in the logbook, and they'll reject it if it isn't. It might say, Tom Buckle, pilot log, right at the top. So it's bloody obvious that all the flights are Tom's flights. But if there's not a column there that says Tom Buckle, they'd reject it. So, it's one of those things. They are getting very pernickety about stuff, and it seems to kind of be getting worse as time goes on. But I suppose that's the job of a regulator, isn't it?
Andrew, a quick question about, in my case, I'm going to want to be, I guess there's an existing, I'm doing this for the university that I work for, and they've got an existing PFCO, and I guess I'm getting added onto that list of remote pilots. What's the process for that?
Okay, well, the process for that is you don't have to worry about an operations manual.
Right.
But we do need to see the operations manual that the university has. So we need to have a copy of that, because when you do your assessment, you're assessed against the ops manual that you're going to be using.
Right, okay.
Yeah, so we want to see you, using the paperwork, following any procedures, any checklists that might be used. Okay. And you'll also, as I'll talk about later on, you'll also be asked a few questions about the ops manual. So you need to be reasonably familiar with it. So that's all. At any point in time later on, though, once you've got that certificate of recommendation, you can go ahead and apply for a permission in your own name, at least up until the end of June, at which time all the regulations change, and it's a slightly different game. But that's subject to another discussion, really.
Sure.
Okay, so let's get into the flight operations assessment specifically and talk about that. What's actually involved?
Can I ask a quick question first?
Of course.
Is there a renewal fee, or is it the same fee as the application each year?
Okay, your audio is a little bit muffled, but I think I've got that. It was the question: is the renewal fee the same as the initial application fee? Is that what you asked?
Yeah.
Okay, it's a little bit less. Right at the moment, it's the initial application fee is 253 quid. The renewal fee is 190. Now that is going to go up in April, but not by very much. I think it's 2.5%, 3%, something like that. So a few pounds.
Okay.
So it's a little bit cheaper. The only caveat to that is if you don't submit your renewal application before your PFCO expires, then they'll still treat it as a renewal, but they'll sting you with the initial application fee. Okay, so there is an incentive to get your, quite apart from the fact you don't want any gaps, there's an incentive to get your renewal in sufficient time to avoid that. Okay, so what to expect? Well, the first thing is we do expect you to do a pre-site assessment for the location where you're doing your assessment. Okay, so you'll be tasked with a really simple mission, which I'll talk about later on. You don't really need to worry about what the mission is before you arrive, but go through the process of planning the operation. So use Google Earth, check out the airspace, have a look at OS maps, you know, do everything that you can. I've gone through in that, you know, there's in the operations planning lesson, but also in the video that most, if not all of you have watched. And fill out a pre-site assessment form, and ideally we'd like you to have a go at a proper risk assessment form as well. Don't go bonkers with it, don't spend hours and hours doing it, but you know, just do you know, 3 or 4 hazards, that kind of top level hazards, really, so that the examiner can see that you're understanding how the risk assessment works. Okay. You will be expected to know your way around the operations manual reasonably well. So as part of the assessment, we've got a list of 35 or so questions, mainly about the ops manual, and the examiner will randomly pick questions to ask you from that. In fact, he may ask you just to, you know, come up with some numbers, and he'll read you the question that corresponds with the numbers that you pick. Have the ops manual with you, either printed or on a tablet or something, because if you really don't know the answer to the question that he's asking, it's fine for you to reference your ops manual to you know, to dig the answer out. But you know, if you sit there going through it page by page, you don't really know, for example, where the emergency procedures section is, then you know, that's not going to impress him. But have it with you, because realistically, you're not going to know your ops manual 100% to have that in your head. But the thing to focus on is emergency procedures, aircraft limitations. So, you know, a question that most examiners, I think, will ask you is, you know, what are the wind limits on your ops manual? So, you know, be familiar with those. You know, it's that type of thing. On-site assessment. So when you arrive on site, typically the examiner will sit down with you and go through your pre-site assessment. You have a cup of coffee, have a chat. He'll talk with you about the mission that he's going to ask you to do. That's going to be something really simple, like essentially fly around the area. There may be some distinctive features there. It might be a shed or a tree, a bush, something like that, or the end of a fence. And he'll ask you to take some photos from varying angles and varying heights of that thing, and then move the aircraft to another location on the site and essentially do the same thing, and then return and land. So, you know, dead simple. You don't really have to worry yourself about the mission, but he'll brief you on that. He'll tell you what he's expecting, and then essentially he'll let you go out and do your on-site assessment. He'll pretty much leave you to just get on with that. So have a walk around the site, look for points of public access, signs of footpaths, any hazards that you might have missed when you did your pre-site assessment. There usually are 1 or 2 things that you may not have noticed looking at satellite imagery. Confirm the stuff that you saw on that you found out during your pre-site assessment, because of course satellite imagery can be out of date, so it's possible that something may have changed in between when, you know, the satellite image was taken and you arriving on site, and take some decisions about where you're going to set up and how you're going to approach this mission. Okay. I wouldn't worry too much about filling out an on-site assessment form unless you want to. There's no harm in using that. But when you go back and see your examiner, he'll just want to talk through or ask you to talk through, you know, did you see anything that you think is relevant, that you need to update your risk assessment with? Where are you going to set up? Are you going to designate an alternate landing site, that type of thing? And the easiest approach to that is actually just give him a little briefing about how you're going to approach the whole exercise. Having done that, you just set up your equipment, you get ready to go, essentially, and your examiner will probably watch you doing that just to see how organized, how structured you are. And if you as a lot of people do, have some sort of checklist for assembling the equipment and getting it ready, then use that checklist and kind of make it visible that you're using the checklist. Not everybody does that. I guess probably these days with the aircraft that are really very easy to, I mean, most of the time you're just kind of getting them out of the bag, unfolding the arms, sticking the battery in, and just giving them a quick look over. If you go back away, actually it could take half an hour to get the aircraft ready, because there's all sorts of stuff you had to screw on and bolt on and check and fiddle around with. So having a checklist for that is probably a bit over the top, I think, for something as simple as a Mavic 2, for example. So having set up, you will need to do a briefing, and the briefing is done on the basis that your flight examiner is fulfilling the role of observer for you. Now, quite often when you do a job, unless you're lucky enough to have somebody that you can bring along as an observer pretty regularly, you're usually having to ask your client to just keep an eye out for air incursions, people on the ground approaching this, that type of thing. And as such, they know nothing at all about what you're doing. So you need to do a reasonably detailed briefing. Don't make it hugely long-winded, because frankly, it just gets boring and people lose the will to live. But make sure you cover the important stuff, like where emergency equipment is, what you're going to be doing, what their responsibilities are, what you need for them to be doing, and how do you want them to behave, where do you want them to stand, how do you want them to communicate with you, and if there's any emergencies that you think you need to brief, given the situation, the mission that you're going to be flying and where it is, then you should brief them as to their roles in an emergency situation. Now, the one emergency that we do expect you to brief is the pilot incapacitation emergency. So if something was to happen to you during the course of the flight that incapacitated you, so you couldn't carry on flying, what would that person who's never had their hands on a drone, they've never seen one until today, what would you expect them to do to deal with that emergency situation? Now, Jeremy, I know you know this, but what about the rest of you? You got any ideas as to what that should be? Those of you that looked at ops manuals will know already, I'm sure, but kind of what would common sense determine is the correct course of action for that person to take, your observer? You have a sneezing fit, or you keel over, or you get a wasp fly inside your shirt or something. What's the most sensible thing for them to do?
I guess if they have no idea about how to operate a drone, to perhaps use the return to home function, or the fail-safe, whatever it is.
Yeah, that's absolutely right, Tom. That's by far the most straightforward way of dealing with it. You could actually say, just leave it where it is. Yeah, don't worry about it, because sooner or later the battery, if we're talking DJI, sooner or later it's just going to hover there, wherever it is. The battery will deplete to the point where it starts doing a return to home of its own accord. So yeah, that's perfectly valid. But even if that's the approach you take, it's still worth explaining to your observer what to expect in that situation. So whether they initiate the return to home or just wait for the battery to deplete.
And where that button is too on the remote.
Yeah, where it is, show it to them. Again, with DJI, you need to explain to them it's not just, you don't just dab it, you're going to need to hold it down until you get some confirmation that the return to home is actually initiated. So, be pretty explicit. Go through that the aircraft's going to fly, turn around, fly fairly fast back towards the takeoff area. Explain that it may well climb up depending on how high you start, and that they should just check to make sure the takeoff and landing area is clear of stuff. They've got plenty of time to move things if necessary. But just talk them through it so that nothing is a surprise, and then they can deal with whatever's causing you the problem. Yeah.
Can I just point out, Andrew, that pressing the return to home, not all the time, it doesn't return to the exact spot as where it took off. You have to be careful with that as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's usually within a couple of meters, or have you experienced more, Jeremy?
You've got you've got your disc out. Sometimes it might not come down on that disc.
Yeah, that's true, and it probably is worth pointing that out. To be frank, it does vary a little bit from aircraft to aircraft, and actually, to a degree, it varies from day to day as well. Quite a lot of the the Mavic range, anyway, have got they use the optical sensor to kind of take a picture of the spot that they've taken off from, and if they can match that up on the way back, then you get a real precision return to home. But it's not 100% reliable. Grass tends to confuse it. In fact, it works better if you've got one of those takeoff and landing pads with a bit of a pattern in an H or something on it. But whatever you think is necessary to brief them on, and it will, you've got to think about, is there something specific about this site or the weather on the day or the aircraft you're using, or any factor that you feel justifies modifying your briefing, then you should do it. We do suggest that you have just a bullet point, what would you call it? A bullet point aid for your briefing, just to give it a little bit of structure and to prompt you to cover kind of the next subject area. So if you think it's going to help, why not come up with half a dozen bullet points that gives your briefing a structure, and then have that laminated ideally, because bits of paper can be a bit of a problem actually out on the flying field if it's windy. So a laminate is always a pretty good idea. And then just have that in your hand as you go through. But particularly in an assessment situation, it's really easy to forget part of it. And if you've got a structure and you start using that structure, before you know it, you can discard the bullet point thing anyway, because you'll be able to do it just by virtue of the fact you've practiced it.
And if you do forget a bit of it, Andrew, well, the assessor won't remind you of it.
I would expect that that the guys, if you miss something important, they'll probably at the end of it, they'll say, that was great, but something you might want to think about adding is, it is easy in that sort of situation to miss something, which is why a bullet point list is a pretty good idea, I think. Do try and remember, you need a little bit of health and safety at the beginning, essentially just telling them that the aircraft's potentially dangerous, so that they shouldn't approach it without your explicit instructions. Make sure they know where the emergency kit is, the fire extinguisher, first aid kit, and so on. And then the rest of it is really, roles, responsibilities. It's not a bad idea, but don't go mad with it. It's not a bad idea just to say what it is we're going to be doing on this flight. Yeah, just a couple of sentences. And it seems a bit silly because the examiner is the guy that's told you what you're going to be doing on the flight, but you've got to kind of get into role. All right. Some of the examiners get seriously into role. So if any of you do your assessment with a guy called Rob Coles, who's our Wiltshire examiner, I think he's an aspiring actor or something, because he seriously gets into playing the silly client, and usually you have a bit of a laugh over it. So get the briefing done, and then really you're ready to go. So do your pre-flight checks, and again, you really should be working to some sort of checklist with this, and it's best to have it laminated. Now, in the ops manual, there is a pre-flight checklist. It's probably a bit long, actually. My intention with that was actually just to give you something to start working with. You make your own mind. There's no absolute right or wrong about a pre-flight checklist. My personal preference is to make it pretty short, because I think the longer it is, the easier it is to miss something. So, but it's up to you. Personal preference is key. There are certain things that, you know, we would expect to see in there. So checking props, make sure that they're undamaged. Just run your fingers over each of them, and you're looking for, you know, if you've operated off gritty surface or something like that, or maybe you've nicked a twig as you've flown close to a tree, anything that might damage the blade. Most blades now, this kind of, I don't know what the material is, but it's like a nylon material. They're okay if they've got little indentations, but anything that's a nick, that's actually a bit of a tear in the prop, you just want to replace it, because that could develop into a prop failure. You don't want a prop disintegrating in flight, because your aircraft will just fall down and hit the ground. So check the props. It's worth picking the aircraft up, and this can be done before you actually put it down on the ground ready for flight. But just look it over. Really make sure everything's secure, that the gimbal's not, you know, flopping around loose. With most of these compact aircraft these days, frankly, it takes seconds to do it. It's really not a big deal. But go through that process and use a checklist for it. And part of the checklist really should include a final look around and confirmation from the reserver that everybody's happy to start operations. Okay, everyone happy with that? I think we talk a little bit more about briefings later on, but I've probably covered it off then. So you get on with the flight assessment, and it's really divided into 2 flights normally. Occasionally it will go into 3, but generally it's 2. And the first flight, the focus is on flying this mock mission, which I'll talk about a bit more in a second. And the second flight, the focus shifts to your ability to control the aircraft with a reasonable level of precision and confidence. And the way we assess that, the basis on which we assess it, is for you to fly a series of maneuvers. And those maneuvers are the ones that are set out, that I'll talk about later on. They're set out in that candidate guide for the flight operations assessment. At any point during either of those flights, you can be and will be given emergencies to deal with, usually just a simulated emergency. But you know, you've got to be prepared every time you fly for there to be a real emergency. You know, it's not any of these sites you can suddenly get dog walkers appear. They all can have low aircraft. There's a few that are pretty close to military bases, helicopter, you know, RAF and Army helicopter sites. So yeah, it's not unusual to have a low-flying helicopter come either over or close by the assessment site. So you've got to be on the ball and be prepared at any point to deal with an emergency. So if members of the public or the RAF are not obliging to give you a real scenario, a real emergency, then your instructor will call out, you know, simulated emergency. There's a low-flying military helicopter coming in from, you know, the direction, whatever that is, and he'll point at it. You've got 10 seconds to make the aircraft safe. So, you know, respond, get the aircraft down as quickly as you can. Ideally position it, if you've got a site where there's high stuff like trees or maybe a building, you move the aircraft towards that, so that you're sort of using that as cover, because the manned aircraft will be seeing things like pylons, buildings, high trees. They'll be giving them plenty of clearance. So if you move your aircraft towards those things, then you're much more likely to have a safe margin. Okay. So when can you take it? Well, you've got to have an approved ops manual. That's really all it boils down to, or an ops manual against which a permission has already been issued, which would be the case for you, Tom. There really is no fixed amount of time. You know, people do ask, how many hours do I need to have flown before I can do my assessment? I wish it was as simple as that, because people learn at different rates, and because it depends what you've been doing when you've been flying. If all that you've done is take it off, push it around the sky a bit, and then bring it back and land it, then you could have 15 hours of flying time and still not really be up to the standard needed. So if you're going to practice, go out and practice and vary what you do, and do stuff that's difficult, and be fairly tough on yourself. Try and be precise about how you control the aircraft. But as a general guide, I think most people, unless you've got directly relevant experience, like, for example, loads of games console time, most people take about 5 hours flying before they start feeling confident that there's some fluidity in the way that they're controlling the aircraft. That's really at the point where they're probably okay to do their flight assessment. To give you an idea, I mean, we've been training some military guys the last few days. We had a group of 10 with 3 instructors yesterday, and none of them had had any time flying these aircraft before. So it was the first time they'd ever had their hands on the sticks, but they'd all got a load of games console time. And I'm not kidding you, within a couple of hours, they were all flying the aircraft at a standard that was going to be perfectly acceptable for them to pass the flight assessment. They just pretty much could do it. So, it depends on your age, your aptitude, the other stuff that you've done, a whole load of things. But fly for as long as you need to start feeling confident about your ability to control the aircraft. At the point that you're feeling that you're, most of the time anyway, that you're ahead of the aircraft rather than behind it, that's a pretty good indicator. Yeah, you'll know, I suspect. We do flight training probably for about a third of our customers. Decide that they want to have a bit of time just as a coaching session with one of our instructors. It's not a bad idea. It's certainly not a requirement. But for half a day, it's it can be useful. Frankly, even if you're flying pretty well, it can be useful. Okay, Barry, I've just got your message. No problem at all. I'll send you a link to that recording sometime. Well, probably tomorrow, I suspect.
Great. Thanks
Okay.
a lot. Take care. Good luck, everyone.
Cheers. Have a good evening.
Bye.
Bye. Okay. Right. So the maneuvers that we're talking about, are any of you flying an aircraft that can be switched into ATI? I mean, they're kind of unusual beasts these days. Is anybody flying a Phantom or an Inspire amongst you?
I have a Phantom and a Mavic Air. Which one would you say I would better do it with? Okay.
Well, honestly, if I was you, I'd probably do it with the Phantom. Actually, is it a Phantom 4 or a 3?
Yeah.
Phantom 4. I'd be inclined to do it with the Phantom. The Mavic Air is pretty small.
Yeah.
I think you'd get more out of it flying the Phantom. But if you fly the Phantom, if you decide to bring that along to your flight assessment, you will be expected to fly it in ATI mode at some point during the course of your assessment. Have you flown it in ATI before?
I think it flicked over to ATI a couple of times automatically.
Okay.
But I've brought it back to land. Just I've never done it. I've never meant to do it.
Okay, so that would have been exciting then. Certainly over the last few days.
Yeah.
I mean, flying in ATI is a really useful skill, which is why I quite like these indoor, the little toy things, because they're always flying in ATI. It is. It doesn't happen very often, but if your aircraft loses GPS, it's going to switch into ATI automatically, and flying an aircraft in ATI is very different to flying it in the normal position hold GPS mode. It will drift with the wind. The wind will take it, and obviously, if there's a strong wind, that happens pretty quickly. But it also, even if it's calm, when you center the sticks, it doesn't break and stop as it would do normally. It will continue in the direction that it was flying until it just runs out of steam under its own inertia. So it's worth, if you've got an aircraft that can be switched into ATI like a Phantom 4, go up when it's a fairly light breeze day, 5 to 8 miles an hour, that sort of thing. Get it somewhere that you're comfortable with, reasonable height, not too far away from you, and switch it into ATI and just wait and see what happens. It will probably do nothing for a second or so, then it will start moving as it accelerates as the wind picks it up and starts carrying it. Start initially just holding it against that wind. Do what the flight controller does, which is lean into the wind to hold position, then move it around a bit, move it from point A to point B, just get used to moving it around. And when you're feeling comfortable with it, start flying it around. It's just a question of getting used to how it feels. Most people are, I think if they enjoy flying, most people end up out of choice flying in ATI because it actually feels a lot more natural, and it's very much smoother than flying in PGPS. In fact, serious videographers, aerial videographers, really don't like aircraft that can't be switched into ATI because they prefer to shoot video flying in ATI. You get much smoother results doing that. So frankly, it's a skill that's worth acquiring. But as time goes on, it seems like less and less aircraft are being delivered with the ability to switch into it. So, but I would use the Phantom out of choice. I think you'd get more out of it. Now, you do need to bring a few bits and pieces with you. You obviously got to have the aircraft. You should have your operator ID. Now, I would, I do check ops manuals to make sure that you've got your CA registration operator ID, but you definitely ought to have it when you arrive at your assessment, and your examiner should anyway be checking your aircraft to make sure that your operator ID is on it somewhere, visible. So, it's tricky. We're not there to enforce those sorts of things, but the fact of the matter is, if you were to do your assessment not having registered without an operator ID on your aircraft, technically you're breaking the law. So we do need to take it seriously. Have at least a couple of battery packs with you, preferably 3, just to give yourself a little bit of leeway. We do need to ID you. So have a driving license or a passport, or some sort of photo ID with you, and you should have valid public liability cover. Now, we'd be happy to accept BMFA. Now, we don't check this. We just ask you to confirm that you got it. BMFA cover is okay. I think for us, it would be all right for you to have something like British Model Flying Association third-party cover. But we do have an arrangement with Cover Drones whereby if you register with them, they give you free cover for your flight assessment. So that's really what we'd encourage you to do. There's no commitment or anything to do that. It's just a question of registering with them, and they'll put you under cover for the day of your flight assessment.
Who did you say that was? Sorry, Andre?
It's Cover Drone, and we do send you, when you get to the point of booking your assessment, we give you a link to the site and a little bit of details. There's others as well. There's quite a few. There's people like Moonrock. Flock Cover is worth looking at because they have quite a neat app that's pay as you fly cover. We don't recommend anybody really other than Cover Drones and Moonrock. Flock, it's frustrating. I love the idea. I think it's brilliantly conceived. The app is very neat. The guys that run it are really clever, but I've heard on the grapevine that they're not very good at paying out, and that's what you buy insurance for, isn't it? So, but I know Cover Drones and Moonrock, for that matter, are really good at paying out promptly and settling claims without making life difficult for you. So, I'm quite happy to kind of put our names behind those guys. Have some basic emergency equipment. So, bring along some sort of fire extinguisher. a first aid kit, and everybody has a mobile with them these days, and make sure you get the fire extinguisher and the first aid kit out in your operating area, you know, so have it accessible quickly and easily, and in sight. Don't leave it in the back of your car. If you leave it in the back of the car, the fire extinguisher, you're sure to get a fire emergency simulated. So, you know, treat that seriously. But that's really all that we expect. A lot of people ask what fire extinguisher. Well, my understanding is that probably foam is the best option. Nothing's perfect, but foam allows you to reasonably effectively prevent the spread of a fire. If it's a lipo fire, you're not going to put it out. Powder really messes up with any electronics that you've got. So if you use powder near your drone, you're not going to recover any of it. It's a bin job. But foam, you know, you can lay a foam ring around the drone if you've landed on fire somewhere where there's combustible material. You know, that seems to be a pretty good option. And, you know, buy something reasonable size, something that is, you know, not so big that you can't run with it, but big enough that you can do something useful with it. It's not a silly little thing that you may have in your car. If you choose to list any equipment in your ops manual, then you should have that with you. Now, our standard ops manual doesn't explicitly list any material, but some do. Tom, for example, your university may well be explicit, especially if they've got multiple pilots, about what you have with you. So they may have in your ops manual that you have to wear yellows, that you put out signage, that you physically cordon maybe the takeoff and landing area, that type of thing. That is pretty common. We've avoided that in our standard ops manual because I prefer, particularly for those people that are operating as individuals, I'd rather not be constrained by something that's written in the ops manual. You know, we give you the leeway to make your own mind up as to what you need for that specific job. And frankly, yellows in particular, whilst they're useful in a lot of situations, they can be a real nuisance in others. So, you know, I think it's better that you just decide what you're going to deploy based on what you think you need.
Andrew, is it possible for me to do the assessment under, if I develop my own operations manual, is that possible for me to do that? And then still, just because for the reason I actually work remotely, so I don't work on campus, and getting hold of, if I haven't seen the operations manual, but getting hold of if they do specify certain equipment that they have available but I can't get hold of for my assessment, that might cause me some difficulties. So
yeah, okay, I don't see any problem with that.
Okay.
You know, take the route as if you were going to be applying for your own permission. So that you've got your own ops manual. I still have to approve it and everything. You know, if subsequently you decide actually that you're not going to apply for a permission, then that's fine. I'd be inclined to suggest you do, you know, particularly if you're going to do stuff for somebody other than the university. With the new regulations coming in, there's going to be a big advantage in having a permission under your belt before we get into July. You know, you might ultimately decide to take another route, but I don't think it's going to be clear until we're some way past July what the best options are going to be.
Sure.
So bird in the hand and all that. I think it's a pretty good idea, Tom.
Okay,
to be
cool.
honest, for not very much more effort. But then you can wait really until, well, June potentially to decide if you actually are going to apply for the permission.
Yeah, sure.
You know? Now, if any of you have, if you're lucky enough to have somebody that is prepared to work as your observer on a regular basis, reasonably regular, and often it's a partner or a friend, then please try and bribe them to come along to help you with the assessment. It's much better. It works better if you if you come along as a team, particularly if that's how you're used to flying anyway. So please do. If you've got somebody like that, then from our point of view, that it's actually more valuable as an exercise. than just having you individually. And again, just as a reminder, please don't forget to do your pre-site survey and bring the documentation along. If you don't do that, if you turn up with no paperwork, you're really going to be on the back foot, for the rest of the assessment. That's a pretty gaping hole. You might be able to bluff it if you've kind of done it and you know what the airspace is, and you can remember that there was a footpath that went through the field. Then you might get away with not actually having any physical paper, but it's going to be tough. And if you're going to do the research, you might as well write it down anyway, and do things like print off. If you're measuring proximities using Google Maps and the distance measuring tools, print those off. Do a screen grab and print it off as part of your file. That's really what you need to do when you're operating anyway. Build a little operations file with all that documentation to back it up, so that you can convince somebody that you really did, you were thorough about planning the operation. Is it difficult? Well, not really. It's not intended to be difficult. We just need to be confident that you've got enough knowledge and flying skills that you can go out and operate safely, and that you're approaching it sensibly and responsibly as well. There's a little bit of attitude goes along with this. I've certainly done flight assessments for a few people where, frankly, they could fly really, really well, but their whole attitude was gung-ho or shambolic. And I've ended up finding a reason to not pass them, because frankly I just wasn't comfortable that they were going to approach it in the right sort of way. So take it seriously. Try and be structured and disciplined about how you do it. Do your best as you're going through the assessment to communicate with your examiner what you're doing and why you're doing it. If you can give them almost a narrative about how you're approaching things, why are you doing this, why are you doing that, then it gives them reassurance, and it also means that they're not having to second guess what you're doing. If you keep quiet, they're having to watch very carefully what you're doing, where your eyes are going, and sort of guess, and they may well ask questions, well, why are you doing that? And that's not necessarily that you shouldn't be doing it, but they want to understand, they want to get some idea of whether you understand why you're doing it. Do you get the drift of that? Okay. A little bit like the driving test, when you do an exaggerated look at the wing mirror before you pull out. It's that type of thing. We do work on a faults basis, a little bit like a driving test. 10 faults or more, or if you're unable to fly any of the maneuvers that we ask you to do, then that would represent a failure. And this is the form that we use for documenting it and for structuring the assessment. So it's broken down into sections. There's the pre-site assessment, going through your paperwork. That includes the 5 questions that we'll ask you about your ops manual. Then there's the on-site assessment, how you approach going about doing your on-site assessment, whether you spotted the kind of important stuff, setting, briefing, and the pre-flight. Then the requested exercises, each of the maneuvers, which I'll talk about in just a second. Waypoint exercises, I don't think any of you will be doing this. This is for things like survey drones, typically fixed wing, that are flown just using a tablet, and essentially you're pre-programming a waypoint flight. And the assessment then assumes quite a different type of approach. Simulated emergencies, and then have you passed or failed, and the examiner does a report at the end of it. When once he gets home, you'll get his report, and that's the basis on which I'm then able to proceed to check your ops manual and then issue your recommendation. Any questions on any of that so far? No?
Okay. Andrew, can I just ask, see, the whole ATTI mode, if you can't fly in that mode, does that go as a fault against you on the assessment, or
if
mark against you?
Well,
just out of curiosity.
Yeah, I mean, it's a little bit It's tricky. Honestly, it's tricky because if you're flying an aircraft that can't be switched into ATI mode, then you can't be asked to fly in ATI mode. Yeah. So to my mind, it seems a little bit unfair. If you struggle to fly in ATI with something that you can switch into ATI, why should you be disadvantaged compared to somebody that comes along with a Mavic 2? So it's difficult, but as far as the CAA and their documentation is concerned, they expect us to check that you are capable of flying in ATI if you have an ATI capable aircraft, switchable aircraft. Now, we don't get you to do everything in ATI. Some of the NQEs I understand do, which is I think is a bit strange. But we'll ask you to do one of the maneuvers or have a go at doing one of the maneuvers in ATI, and I'll explain which one that usually is. To be frank, if you do,
if you can't fly in ATI, though, it's irrelevant, really, is that?
Well,
or does it go as a mark against you?
No, not well. I suppose worst case it could be a fault, but I think you'd be pretty tough as an examiner. If you've got an aircraft that flies ATI, go and have a go, have a little bit of a practice. It's really not that difficult, and it's worth doing because one day you might find you unexpectedly get into ATI and you have to deal with it. And if you aren't capable of dealing with it, you could easily lose the aircraft, which actually is why the CA want us to check that you can fly in ATI. It's just that, practically speaking, the aircraft that people are coming along to assessments with these days usually can't be switched into ATI, so it just can't be done. So I wouldn't worry too much about it. If you're talking about doing the Phantom 4, bringing the Phantom 4 along.
Sorry, well, I've got a Mavic 2. I know that there was another guy who was asking about.
Oh yeah, sorry, it wasn't you, was it?
But
Neil?
I was reading it from the other side. Sorry.
Yeah, no. If you've got a Mavic 2, well, you're kind of off the hook, really. But that's perfectly okay. It makes no difference. All that happens is in our flight report, just on file, really, we just make a note that we weren't able to check that you could fly in ATI. It makes no difference.
I thought I'd read somewhere somebody saying that they got a fault against them because of that.
No. That's nonsense. It's perfectly acceptable.
On the internet, so
No, well, that's the trouble. And it is confusing because if you look at the original CAP 722, it very clearly states that it's an absolute requirement that we watch you fly in ATI. But that was before all these aircraft came along that couldn't be switched into ATI. So, they've taken a pretty practical approach, which is essentially to say we modify the flight assessment based on the capabilities of the aircraft, because that's the limitation. And it makes no difference whatsoever to your application, the permission you're granted, or anything at all. We just make a note on the file, say, we with a Mavic 2, you can't test in ATI, so that wasn't covered. So it makes no difference for you.
Okay. Cool.
Okay. Right. Let's talk about the maneuvers. I'm conscious that time is getting on. So I suspect we've probably got 20 minutes or so to run with this. So we'll try and go through them reasonably quickly. But this is the important part of the evening. So heading and drift control. Typically, you'll do this as part of the mission. Okay. So what we're looking for here is for you to have the confidence and ability to move your aircraft around relative to things that are out there in your flying area. So you'll be asked to take off and then fly off to a point. Usually it's something that's visual. So as I say, it might be a bush or a shed or something like that. Take some photos and then fly directly from point B to point C. Now this will vary from site to site. So this diagram is just representative of the type of thing that we'll ask you to do. But in a real situation, point C could easily be over here, not back here. Okay, so don't take this too literally. But part of what we're looking for here is can you confidently fly a reasonably straight line from this point to this point? Okay, when people first start flying, they find that quite difficult, and if you ask them to fly to point C, what would typically happen is they would return the aircraft back to in front of them and then fly out to point C. Okay, what we're looking for is you to fly from one point out there to another point out there, and some of the sites have some sort of line feature, so the examiner will probably say to you, fly to that next point and do your best to follow the line feature. It could be a hedge or a fence or something like that. It might even be certain times of year, a farmer's track through a wheat crop or something. But you get the idea. Now, if you're asked to follow a line feature, then he will expect to see you starting to use the image that you're getting back from the camera to help you with that. Okay. And as part of this whole exercise, when you do the mission, one of the things he's looking at is, are you keeping an eye on the information that you're getting displayed on the tablet? So are you monitoring your battery condition? Are you are you glancing at it fairly regularly? Are you paying attention to it? Are you paying too much attention to it? Because whilst you need to be tracking that stuff, what we don't want you to be doing is flying the aircraft solely by reference to the picture that's coming down, flying, as some of you will know the term first person view, or FPV. We don't want you to be kind of drifting into actually flying at FPV when you should be flying at visual line of sight. It's a delicate balance, and in a lot of operations there are points in the operation where actually you need to be looking at the screen more than the aircraft. So, for example, the exercise we were doing yesterday, we had a sign out in the middle of the field, quite a distance away, with a number on the back of it, probably 4 inches high, on a white sheet of paper. And we were getting these guys to fly out and position the aircraft so that they could take a photograph of the numbers. It's quite difficult to do. Depth perception becomes quite challenging, and so on. So in that situation, they ended up, once they got relatively close to this thing, they ended up actually having to reference the screen more than they were visual line of sight. But we're really looking for, particularly in that first mission, we're looking for how confident you are handling the aircraft, moving it around, moving it from point to point, and maneuvering it relative to objects out there. Okay, maneuvering it around the object, up and down relative to the object, and so on. So other than giving you a little bit of direction as to what he wants you to do, the examiner probably isn't going to say an awful lot during that first flight. Okay, so that's really what we mean by heading and drift control. And one point that I'm trying to make, not very well actually, in this diagram, is that there's one or two of the sites where there's the opportunity to ask you to fly from point C to point D, and if you were to take a direct line, you'd end up flying directly over you and the examiner, and you want to avoid doing that. You always want to really be out forward of where you're standing. So if you recognize that that's what would happen if you fly a straight line, just modify the line so that you do a little bit of a banana shape and make sure you keep the aircraft out in front of you. Okay? Right. Climb and descent. This is quite a fun one, actually. Think of it as a backwards ascending selfie. You position the aircraft out in front of you, round about room height, not too far away, and rotate it so that the camera's facing you. We then want you to climb the aircraft and move backwards at the same time, so as to achieve as close as you possibly can to a 45-degree climb. climb up to either a designated height. Your examiner may well say climb to 30 meters or 20 meters. He might just keep you climbing and then say, okay, stop. And once you've stopped, you'll be expected to take a few deep breaths and then descend back down that same line. So a nice, smooth, consistent descent rate to arrive back at the point that you started. That, on the face of it, sounds relatively simple, but it's kind of one of those things that's easier said than done. It requires coordination of pushing the left-hand stick forward to get an ascent rate, and managing the speed by pulling backwards on the right-hand gimbal to move the aircraft backwards. There are a few things that make a difference with people being able to do this or not. The first is almost everybody, when they first start doing it, ends up shallow, at about 20 degrees rather than 45 degrees. Now, one of the causes of that problem is that they move the aircraft too fast. So they push too far back on the right-hand stick. The aircraft starts moving backwards fast enough that they can't match and they can't get enough climb rate to achieve a 45 degrees. So inevitably they end up shallow. So try and keep the speed under control. We're talking about a brisk walking pace, really. And a good technique is actually to start by moving the aircraft backwards, get the speed that looks right, and then feed in climb until you've got a decent angle, the angle that you're looking for. Okay, and you will find that if you do that, you kind of lead with one control and then follow quite quickly with the second control. Try and focus on not continually pulling back with that right-hand stick. There is a tendency to keep moving it as you feed in climb with the left-hand stick. Try and keep it pegged, and then feed in a climb until you get the angle you need. And you'll find that you would probably only have to do that 3 or 4 times, and actually the gap between you starting to move backwards and feeding in the climb will get smaller and smaller to the point where you know what the stick positions are. You just go straight to it. The other thing that makes a difference with this is that a lot of people frankly just can't visualize what the aircraft at a 45 degree position would be. So if you do find that you're shallow, well, actually one way of finding out whether you're shallow is when you've got to that point B, look at your telemetry, how far out you are from the takeoff point and how high you are, and those numbers should be about the same. So they should be, if you're climbing 30 meters, you should be more or less 30 meters away from the point that you started. That's kind of going to be 45 degrees. So visualize that by moving the aircraft deliberately to that. So climb it to 30 meters and then fly out 30 meters. Get that picture in your head. That's where you're aiming to get the aircraft the next time you try it. Okay. Is that clear? Yeah. The other thing that can screw this up is inadvertently, when you push the left-hand stick forward, feeding in a little bit of yaw. And what happens then is the climb becomes banana-shaped, because without realizing it, you're actually asking the aircraft to rotate at the same time. So you end up with a kind of climbing turn. Albeit very slow, and that inevitably happens. Most people, when they're moving the sticks around the gimbal, just because of the way your fingers or thumbs articulate, you end up, without realizing it, pushing it, in the wrong sense a little bit. Now, if you really struggle with that, if that becomes a problem and you're not able to kind of dial it out, try just putting your finger behind the stick, so that you're not holding it, you're just pushing it forward, and then the spring loading of the stick should keep it centered. Okay. But if you've got a banana shaped climb, that's what's going on. It's nothing to do with the wind. It's just you're asking the aircraft to turn, but you're not realizing you're doing it. Okay, the next one. Now, if you're flying in ATI, this is the one that we would typically ask you to do in ATI because it's pretty straightforward, but it does require for you to be anticipating what's going on with the wind and compensating for it. So the idea is you start off again, comfortable height, usually about room height, a sensible distance away from yourself. You then do the first leg, which is, if there's a choice, you try and do this into wind. It depends a little bit on the wind direction and the layout of the site. But you know, if possible, you do that into wind. You might choose to climb a bit on that first leg to get the aircraft a little bit higher. You don't go out that far. This doesn't need to be a huge rectangle, okay? But your examiner will tell you when to make the turn. You then turn 90 degrees, fly out away from you on a kind of continue that 90-degree path. Whoops, sorry, I didn't mean to do that. Let me, a bit trigger happy here. And another 90 degree, do a downwind leg, so you fly past yourself but further out, and then more or less equidistant on the right hand side, do a 90-degree turn to come back towards you, and then a final 90-degree turn to return back to the starting point. And you may need to descend. You know, if you climbed here, you're going to need to reduce the you know, pull back the left hand stick a little bit to descend back to where you started. Now it's up to you whether you stop and rotate at each of these points, or whether you fly the aircraft around the turn. Okay, so you've got that choice. My take on this is that actually, if you're confident to fly a 90-degree turn, so if you're confident, you know, flying around a corner, I think it's easier to do that, because the problem with rotating 90 degrees is that once the aircraft's a bit of a distance away from you, it's very difficult to see and judge that the aircraft has turned through 90 degrees. So if you get to here and actually you turn the aircraft 80 degrees, what's going to happen? It's going to start going off this way, and you have to adjust it. And that can happen on any of the corners. And of course, it can be quite difficult to assess whether it's on track or not. If you fly around that corner, then you can see when it looks like it's 90 degrees, and then just take the turn off and carry on straight. Okay.
If you did veer off your straight line, Andrew, then would that be a fault?
No. Well, it wouldn't be. It would be a fault if you didn't do anything about it. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So if you can see that the aircraft is drifting off course, do something about it. So, for example, if you stopped and turned what you thought was 90 degrees, but it was only 75 or 80, and you can see it starting to drift off to the left, drift away from you, then put in a bit of right stick, you know, on the right hand gimbal, give it some right stick, so get it to slide back into line, so it's kind of crabbing, if you like, but you know, it's the path of the aircraft that we're interested in, and it's probably easier to lean right on that right hand stick than try and rotate the aircraft to compensate for it. Okay, these aircraft don't care which way they're traveling, makes no difference aerodynamically. They're just as happy flying sideways or diagonally as forwards. So yeah, if you see it's drifting off to the left or right, just move that right hand stick to compensate for it and re-establish a straight line. Okay. Other than that, you know, the only thing to say about this is if you're doing it in ATI, you're going to have to anticipate what the wind's doing. And if the wind was coming from the right, the area that gets difficult is, you know, this leg's fine. You're going to have to push against the wind a little bit. This leg, you're going to have to lean left to compensate for the wind. But you just watch the aircraft, see what it does. If it looks like it's drifting in, you need a bit more left stick. If it looks like it's drifting out, then you know, back off and give it maybe even some right stick. But the point that it tends to go wrong is this downwind leg. So if you rotate 90 degrees or fly through that turn, if you're used to flying in PGPS, you're used to having to push that stick to get the aircraft to move. If there's a wind coming from the left, then you may not need any stick at all, any forward pressure. Just let the wind take it down. If you push in the same way that you do flying a PGPS, it can go scooting off down here like a scalded cat, and you end up probably overshooting this turning point, and it all gets completely out of hand here. So if it's a bit windy and you're having to fly this in ATI, let's assume that the wind's coming from the left. As you make that turn, I would suggest, don't rush it. Just leave that stick neutral, see what the aircraft does. If you think it's going really too slowly, give it a little bit of forward stick just to get it moving along. But, don't just push that stick forward hard, because it will end up going really fast down here. In fact, if it's windy enough, you might even need some backward stick to control the speed going down this leg. Okay, but if you get some practice flying around in ATI, you'll find that you'll be able to do that without too much difficulty. Okay, and the examiner is going to take account of the conditions. He's not going to expect you to fly a precision rectangle if it's really breezy. In fact, he may even get you to do another much simpler maneuver in ATI, just to be confident that you could recover the aircraft in an emergency if you needed to. Right, figure of 8. Now, for most people, this is the most difficult one because it requires the most coordination of controls of any of these maneuvers. Just to explain how this works, this is looking at the maneuver from above. You move the aircraft out maybe a little bit further than normal, because the first part of that flight you're actually flying in towards you. So move it out, rotate the aircraft so it's pointing kind of over your shoulder. So if we were starting with this left-hand circle, you'd have it pointing over your left-hand shoulder at about 45 degrees. Start the aircraft moving and fly it around a nice circle. Come back towards yourself in front of you, and then take off that turn, and almost immediately start turning in the opposite direction to complete that figure of 8. And what we're looking for, within reason, is for you to try and achieve the same sort of size circle both sides, and to control the speed so that the speed is consistent. And perhaps fly the maneuver at different speeds. So one, really slow, and then maybe a little bit more briskly. Most people, when they start doing this, will control the aircraft simply by moving it forward and introducing yaw, so left and right with the left stick. The problem with that is it will go around a circle, but it's skidding around the circle. And what you want to aim at is introducing bank into the turn as well, so introducing roll. And in an ideal world, what you're doing is actually flying the aircraft, your quadcopter, like a real aircraft, so that it's banking around the turn, and it's looking like a kind of fixed wing going round a turn. And I've got a video that I'll show you in just a second that makes that, I think, reasonably clear. You'll find if you can introduce bank into the turn, if you're not already doing it, you're going to be much better able to control the size of these circles. It's actually very difficult to control the size of the circle just using forward speed and yaw, because you're skidding, or because the aircraft's skidding around that turn. Now, when you start introducing bank, if you're not already doing it, start off by moving the sticks, more or less the same distance. I sometimes say, well, try and imagine there's a lollipop stick stuck to the top of the sticks. So as you would normally, perhaps, you've started off using as you'd move that left-hand stick, try and imagine you got to move the right-hand stick the same distance, okay? That's not going to be perfect, but it's a really good start, and you'll have to adjust it a little bit to get it right. But you will get it right eventually with enough practice, and then you'll go, oh yeah, okay, I've got it, and then you'll lose it for a minute or two, and then you'll get it again, and eventually you'll find that you can just do it. You can get it to look right. So let me change this this screen so that can you all see the grass thingy? Okay, now this is a simulator, so it's not a real film or anything, but I'll talk you through it. So we take off, and one of the things that's worth mentioning is whenever you take off, certainly doing your flight assessment, you should do a control set check. So a dabber forward, dabber backwards, left and right, and then yaw. Just make sure the aircraft's responding as it should. And then position to start the maneuver. So in this case, we're rotating left to get the aircraft facing over that left-hand shoulder. And then start it moving. And can you see that it's banking? It's not doing that turn flat. Okay, it's actually leaning to the left for a left-hand corner, left-hand turn, and then, sorry, leaning to the right rather, and then leaning to the left to do this left-hand circle. Okay, crossing over, yeah, more or less in front of you. And these aren't perfect. This simulator is a bit strange to fly, but the main purpose of this was actually for you to see the aircraft doing a banked turn, and that's really what you're aiming to achieve. So fly it around, just start off doing a circle, okay, and play with the controls until you can do a circle, and it's looking like that. Yeah, the front isn't, it's not over rotating, you don't end up flying sideways. It's the nose is pointing in the direction that the aircraft's traveling. And vary the size of the circle, get used to controlling the size of the circle, the speed that the aircraft's flying. You see it's speeding up a little bit here, but you kind of get the idea. It's like all of these things, you just got to do it and practice it a bit, and it will click, and then you'll wonder why you ever had any trouble with it, because you'll find it easy. Okay, any questions on that maneuver specifically? No. Okay. It's quite satisfying when you get it right and it comes together. And it's a really good exercise in coordination. So let's go back to, gosh, where's it gone? Hang on just a second. Oh, here we go. Okay, so that's it as far as maneuvers are concerned. There's only one other that I will mention to you that is impossible to put a diagram together for, and that's it's not really a maneuver, it's an exercise which we refer to as a disorientation exercise. And what we do is we get you to fly out a fair old distance, and to the point where it's getting quite difficult to see the aircraft. I mean, you can see that it's there, but you can't really see which way it's facing. We'll then get you to spin the aircraft around, and what we want you to do is recover the aircraft, so to bring it back home without referencing the screen or pressing return to home. And there's a number of ways that you can do this, but our strong recommendation, and something that you can very easily practice, is to fly the aircraft in a circle. Now, obviously, you've got to be at the point where you can comfortably fly the aircraft in a circle at a distance. Okay, so flying around in a circle is a good practice thing to do anyway. Start off relatively close to you, and when you feel that you can reliably fly a circle, then try this exercise. So take it out a reasonable distance, stop it, spin it around, and then start flying. And I would suggest a left-hand circle. It doesn't really matter, but be consistent. But I'll explain it based on a left-hand circle. So you start flying a circle, and imagine that you just flew circle after circle after circle, and the aircraft's going around like this. Now, if you're looking at how it's tracking across the horizon, it's moving to the left, and then it moves to the right. It pauses for a little while and then starts tracking left. Then there's a pause, then it starts tracking right, and then there's a pause and it starts tracking left. Now, as it comes round to the left and there's the pause, just before it starts tracking right, take the turn off stop if necessary, take your hands off the stick, and then push forward stick. And at that point, the aircraft should be pointing more or less towards you. Okay. And so the aircraft will fly back towards you. It may not be exactly towards you, but it will be in your general direction. It will certainly get closer. And as it gets closer and you can see it better, you can then adjust the flight track to bring it back to land it or whatever. So you can practice doing that. You don't actually have to take it very far away from yourself to do it. It's a really worthwhile exercise. If you ever were to unexpectedly lose GPS and maybe you didn't notice and it goes scooting off with the wind, if you're good at doing that and you can do it quickly, you'll probably be able to recover the aircraft even if it is far enough away that you lose orientation. It's a bit of a get out of jail skill, so well worth practicing. And obviously you don't have to keep flying around in circles before you take the decision. If you only really need to wait until you get that movement left and then stop, and that it might just start doing that straight away. If it's facing in that general direction, it won't go right, it will just start going left. And if you've practiced it a bit, you'll recognize that, and as soon as it stopped going left, you just take the turn off and push that stick forward to bring it back home. Okay, so have a bit of a practice of that, but it's an exercise that we build into the flight assessment. So where can you take the assessment? Well, I think you guys are all over the place, but we've got a site in Cornwall, one up in Cumbria, Leicestershire, Northern Ireland, Oxfordshire, West Sussex, and Wiltshire. Does anybody need to know, closer proximity than that, or are you happy just with those counties? Shout out if you want to know, like what's the nearest town in one of those places. No, don't care. All right.
I'll need to know whenever I'm doing it, I suppose.
Okay. Now, right. Well, the Northern Ireland one is near Newry. That's easy.
Okay.
Yeah.
Whereabouts the Cumbria one is it?
Okay, it's Kirkbride Airfield.
Kirkbride.
Which is, well, the closest town. It's not that close, but this is Cumbria, so nothing's that close in Cumbria. But the closest town is Carlisle, I believe. Yeah, decent size. Sorry, did somebody say something?
Yes, the Cornwall one is Perranporth.
It is, yeah, just outside Perranporth. So now the one thing about the Cumbria site is when you come to book your assessment, with our booking system, the guy that does Cumbria has a really unpredictable schedule. He does a lot of work with the nuclear industry. So he doesn't feel that he can kind of have his diary up there with available slots in any useful way. So what we do, if you want to book for Cornwall, for Cumbria rather, just let us know and we'll put you directly in touch with the examiner, and then you can just kind of agree a date that works for both of you.
He left me a voicemail saying he was very busy and he'll try and fit it in, but I've still
that was Ian, was it?
Yes,
yeah. I mean, his work kind of fluctuates. Sometimes he's just absolutely maxed out, and then he'll have slack time. So I'm sorry about that. If it drifts on too long, you might need to do it in probably Leicestershire as the.
I mean, it's okay. I mean, I was busy myself the last week as well, so I'm not been able to catch up with him again. But,
okay. I mean, Ian is really good though. I mean, if you can hang on and do it with him, he's really experienced and he's got a lot of, he treats it seriously and he spends a lot of time with you, going through things in detail. So I mean, you would get a lot out of doing your assessment with Ian, but he's a busy guy, and yeah, I mean, it's a shame. I mean, it's nice for him, I guess, but all our examiners are freelancers. Most of them, the guy in Oxfordshire is retired pretty much. So, and a couple of the guys run their own businesses, so they can control their time a little bit more. But Ian is a little bit at the beck and call of his customers. So, and he does seem to get busier and busier. I can see a time unfortunately when I think he might say, look, I just can't do this anymore. But you know, if you're happy just to bide your time and wait.
I'm happy to wait for him just now. Anyway.
Cool. Okay, that's great. Okay, you book it. This is the online system. I mean, it's dead easy. Essentially, you pick the area you want to do it in, and then you're presented with a calendar with available slots. They all vary. Some of them do 2 or 3 days a week. Some of them do weekends. Some of them do weekdays. Most of them have good availability, so you shouldn't need to wait. Once you feel like you're ready, you shouldn't need to wait to book. And if you need to do it on a particular day, well, you might need to perhaps not do it with the one that's nearest you if they're not available. Perhaps be prepared to hop in the car and drive a little bit further, but it shouldn't be too difficult. The other thing you can do with this booking system is if you want to do some training, then you can book that as well. And in fact, something that's quite popular is to do a half day's training immediately before you do your assessment. So you kind of book to do the training and then go straight into your assessment afterwards. Maybe a bit of a break for lunch or something, but essentially you back to back them. And the way that works is if your examiner really doesn't feel you're ready to do it, he'll tell you, and then you just book to do your assessment another time. Now, I can only think of a couple of times that's happened, but it's quite a good way of doing it because it does de-stress the assessment. Because you already have spent a few hours with the examiner, you'll feel more confident about where you are. If you had any rough edges, hopefully you'll have had enough time to get those sorted out. So it seems to work really well. But frankly, most people don't need it. It's just going to be your decision as to whether you do that. Let's just talk quickly about weather. Obviously, weather can get in the way. You can change your booking using that system, but if you do it within 72 hours, then we need to know about it. So you have to contact our office, let us know. We need to make sure the examiner knows that you've rescheduled. One point that I would make quite strongly is in your ops manual, you'll have a maximum wind that you're happy to operate at. If the forecasted wind is within those limits, you should go ahead and do your flight assessment. Okay, don't wait for that nice, light breeze day and keep rescheduling it. If the wind's within your limits, you should go ahead and do it. So from that point of view, I would really suggest that you go out and practice flying in some brisk winds. Get to know how your aircraft behaves in strong winds. I mean, it was pretty damn breezy yesterday. We were only flying little Parrot and Affis, which weigh half what a Mavic weighs. I mean, they're 350, 400 grams. And I tell you, they dealt with it absolutely fine, and the DJI stuff certainly does. They're more than happy flying in winds that are uncomfortable to stand in this time of year. So, yeah, it's not the aircraft limit. It is kind of more just understandably you feel you want to do it on a really nice day. But I'm afraid, slots are precious, and if it's doable, you should go for it.
And if it gives a good chance of rain, should you cancel?
I think if it's marginal, Nick, you just want to you want to liaise with the examiner and take a mutual decision. It's quite unusual that it's going to rain. We end up with rain the whole day. I mean, actually, it doesn't seem like that at the moment, but generally, you might get rain on and off, and we're only looking really at about 20 to 25 minutes actual flying. So
you can wait for a.
I think you've just got to decide based in part on how far you're traveling. If it's marginal, if you're not sure, just pick up the phone, have a chat with the examiner, and you talk about it and make a decision together. Yeah.
Okay.
I can't really say any more than that. I mean, the only time that we would treat it as a fail is if somebody pretty much completely disregards the weather and presses on with it, even though it was forecasted quite clearly to be unsuitable. and that, to my recollection, has only ever happened once. So, just be sensible about it. It does depend a little bit on how far you're traveling. Obviously, if somebody's having to travel a long way to get to the assessment site, you want to be pretty confident that you're going to be able to do the assessment when you get there. That's just kind of common sense. So you're probably a little bit more conservative about it. But only you really can make that judgment. And the weather's a bit of a variable feast. It's not inconceivable that the forecast looks okay, you travel there, and actually the weather's nothing like the bloody forecast, and you end up having to just hang around and then give up. That's happened a few times, I promise you. And you need to be prepared for that to happen potentially, especially this time of year. But generally it's okay. Generally it's all right. But you probably need to be reconciled to at least the possibility that you need to reschedule once or twice because of the weather. Particularly the time of year that you're doing it, it's the number of decent flying days is pretty low at the moment. So that's what we charge. If you're doing one-to-one flight training, I wouldn't recommend a full day. It's too much for most people. Half a day is fine. You get enough to give you real progress and a bit of a structure to go off and practice. People generally are maxed out after half a day of reasonably intense flying. So it's not so bad if you can get a group of you together, 2 or 3 people, that works well. But if it's just you, half a day is plenty. Finally, I just wanted, if you haven't already discovered it, just to point out there's some pretty useful Facebook groups out there. So have a bit of a hunt around. We have a private group for UAV Academy students and staff and partners. It's if you do a search for UAV Academy students, you'll find it. If you want to get involved, just put in a join request, and I'll authorize that. And finally, most of you probably found this already. Some of you may have found us through this, but we have a public Facebook page, which is just UAV Academy. And if ever you feel inclined to leave us a decent review, that would be the place to do it, please. It works really well for us. Awful lot of people come through Facebook to find us. So any kind of testimonials, it's there really is where it would be most useful. So that's it in terms of what I wanted to cover. Has anybody got any questions about all the stuff we've talked about, or you've had enough, I suspect? Just want to get on with the rest of your lives. Any questions at all?
Can I chat with you, Andrew, just about the operations manual? I think there was somebody from my company did it recently on one. I think I might be able to use his.
Yeah, probably. Yeah, Nick, I would have thought so. If you can, would you be flying on that permission? Or would you be doing it under your own name?
It'll be under the company name.
Okay, well, track the ops manual down, have a read through it, and when you're ready to do your assessment, just whack a copy of it over to us, a PDF, so that we can pass it on to the examiner. But if that's the case, let me know, because you can bypass the whole ops manual thing and just go straight to your flight assessment.
Okay.
Yeah, perfect. All right. Okay. Sorry, Neil.
Can I ask quickly? Just because I think you maybe mentioned it last year, is there a reason why I shouldn't fly using a tablet on the controller? Rather, well, it's a Mavic 2. You can mount a phone in it, type thing, or you can use.
Yeah, I mean, to be frank, when I'm doing training, I fly a Mavic and Phantom. We often don't put the tablet on at all.
Yeah, it's just I vaguely remember you saying you're better not to, but I couldn't really remember.
Well, I think when you first start,
the controls a little bit as well. That's the
well, certainly I don't like a big tablet. Like some people, in the days of the Phantom, you used to put a full-sized iPad on it, so it's horribly out of balance. You know, I thought it was just ridiculous, really. To my mind, the Optimum really is one of these mini tablets. And I'm not quite sure what the dimensions are. Probably, I don't know, somewhere between 7 and 9 inches. That seems to work pretty well. But it depends a little bit. You know, one of those don't fit very well on certainly the original Mavic controller. It will just about manage an XL phone, but that's about it.
I was thinking it might interfere with something to do with the exam, but I couldn't.
No, I don't recollect anything. I may have said something, but yeah. But you know, for training, I think actually, particularly when you're starting out, that what's going on the tablet is a bit of a distraction.
Yeah.
So I'm more than comfortable with people just using the controller and the LED lights on the aircraft to get an idea of what's going on. Yeah, it will come back and land if the battery gets too low. It will start flashing, orange and then red. So if you're paying attention, you shouldn't really get into any trouble with it. But probably don't take it too far away, because you've not got as many aids to orientation and to getting the thing back. But for just straightforward flight skills training, I think it's actually a pretty good idea to just forget about the tablet and all that stuff. Just focus on the aircraft and the controller.
That's maybe what you said the last time.
It may well have been, yeah. Yeah. Okay.
Thank you.
Going back to logbooks, is this any good for logbook wise?
UAV pilot logbook. Oh, it's a printed one. Yeah, do you know, I've not seen that version of it. Did that come from the guys, what are they called, Phoenix, down in...
I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I can't see it, Jeremy, but I'm sure it's fine. I mean, it looks pucker.
I have got a spreadsheet one on the computer as well, but I didn't know whether it'd be worth doing a handwritten one as well. Like.
Yeah, there's nothing wrong with that. And if you do that, then just scan the page. They're quite happy to accept that. It doesn't have to be computer based, as long as your writing's kind of legible.
Oh yeah. One more little thing, Andrew. I've done my ops manual. Can you just confirm that you've received it? Because I don't know whether I've sent it right to you, if you see what I mean.
Oh, okay. Is this fairly recent, Jeremy?
I sent it on Sunday evening.
Okay. I've been catching up with emails today. I've effectively been offline the last 3 days because running a ground school for the first time in a long while, and I forget how first of all, how tired you get.
Yes.
Doing kind of 9 hours on your feet, but also you're offline the whole time as well. So I'm horribly behind. But I'll jot it down now, and I will check it first thing tomorrow morning.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Andrew.
Okay. All right, folks. Thank you very much. Nice meeting those of you that met for the first time, and congratulations on getting through that exam. We'll get you moved on to complete it all. Have a good evening.
Thank you very much, Andrew.
Okay.
Thank you.
Cheers. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.